Hi, and welcome everyone. My name is Sally Abid. I am an elected member of the National Leadership of Standing Together. Standing Together is a Jewish Arab grassroots movement here in Israel. We organize and mobilize people all throughout the country around issues of peace, equality, and social justice.
My name is Ilya Abramovich. I'm also part of the leadership of Standing Together and part of the leadership of our climate action group. We are working together with environmental organizations and labor movements and building an Israeli version of the Green New Deal, largely influenced by a talk we had with Professor Paulin over a year ago. And we are very, very excited to have you here as our guest today. Really, truly honored.
Thank you. My pleasure.
I'll quickly introduce you. Noam Chomsky is an Institute Professor Emeritus at MIT and Laureate Professor at the University of Arizona. His contributions to linguistic research, political philosophy, cognitive science, and political discourse in general put him as one of the leading thinkers and also activists of our time. Robert Paulin is a distinguished professor of economics and co-founder of the Institute of Political Economy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Professor Paulin is one of the leading voices in progressive economics, dealing with labor movement, inequality, industrial development, and of course, the green economy. Professor Paulin has been writing on the concept of a Green New Deal for years now, way before it was cool, and working with governments and organizations in bringing on a more egalitarian transition to a greener economy.
Today we will be discussing their latest book, Climate Crisis and the Global Green New Deal, The Political Economy of Saving the Planet. The book, which has been called a survival manual for civilization, details the dangers and urgency in dealing with the issue of man-made climate change, the political mechanisms that maintain and profit from it, and lays out a clear way to really an attainable plan for how to transition to a green economy, while also fighting inequality and reaching a more democratic society. We are truly so excited and so honored that you are with us, both of you. But first of all, we would like to know how we should address you. I know that Bob, you like to be addressed as Bob. And we would like to know how to address you. Professor Chomsky? No. I don't think.
You know how to pronounce it.
That's great. So Noam, we have a lot to discuss, but first we really want to really let you know how excited we are for this. This is not taken for granted. Bob, you have been a consistent ally for Standing Together for our movement, as Eli really mentioned. But Noam, you are really, this is the first time that we're in touch with you. And since 2000, you were banned from entering into Israel in 2010. And before banning leftists was the norm in Israel, really. And how does it feel to be crossing the border virtually with us?
Delighted to be with you. And in the book, actually, we discuss some of the analyses given by very distinguished Israeli climate scientists who describe the future of the Levant, in Israel in particular, if we pursue our current course, which they regard as totally suicidal. They basically say Israel is lost by another couple of decades. The Mediterranean during the summer will reach the heat of a jacuzzi. You won't be able to go into it. Fish will die, so on. The rising sea level will inundate the coastal plains. Jerusalem will still be there, Ramallah will still be there, but the country, much of it will be underwater, unlivable. These are the kinds of consequences that will indeed happen in large parts of the world, some much more serious even than the disappearance of much of Israel or the unlivability of it. The plains of Bangladesh, when they're inundated, that means that hundreds of millions of people have to flee. That happens to them. The South Asia already is suffering from severe shortage of water, extreme heat, temperatures going up to 50 degrees centigrade. Also happens where I live in Arizona, but this is a rich country. We have air conditioning. We're not poor peasants living in a hovel somewhere. India and Pakistan are both suffering from the same shortage as the rivers dry up. To even more threats. These are nuclear-armed states. As soon as they begin a conflict over minimal water resources, you can predict what will happen. Without going on, the current course is fundamentally suicidal. Now, as Bob has pointed out and developed in great detail, and this is the crucial point of the matter, there are solutions, but not for long, a couple of decades maybe. There are solutions to make a better life. They will mitigate this crisis. Can't reverse what has happened, but that opportunity simply has to be grasped. So that's the crucial message.
Yeah, and we will really talk about this throughout the hour, throughout the interview that we have. Thank you.
So the disproportion between the scales of the danger climate change poses to human life on one end and the reluctance of governments to act decisively upon it on the other is indeed quite staggering. It's denied outright by the Republican Party in the US and maybe more severely by omission by the Israeli government. How do you explain this discrepancy between those two items, and how do you think we can overcome it?
Only one way to overcome it is by popular activism, to compel governments to do what has to be done to save human life on Earth. And incidentally, not just human life. We're in the midst of what's called the sixth extinction, massive destruction of species. It's happening at an incredible rate, at the highest rate that's known in the geological record. It's reaching a point of approximately 65 million years ago when an asteroid hit the Earth, pretty much ended the age of the dinosaurs, left room for other animals to survive. Small mammals ultimately evolved into humans. Now we're reaching the same point. At that point, maybe 70 or 75% of the species on Earth were destroyed. We're getting there. 40% of plant species have already disappeared. Animal species are declining. The difference between now and 65 million years ago is we're doing it much more rapidly. That was one event that happened, destructive. Now there's a process that's taking place, which humans are crucially involved in. It's not just global warming, it's also habitat destruction, really the basis for the pandemic that's now taking place. So these are all matters that can be controlled, but those Israeli analysts, again, one of them just said, I'm glad I'm not going to be alive in 50 years.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a generational thing as well. I think that much of our politics and much of our public discourse is managed by an older generation that that really, you know, doesn't see. For me, I see that this is an issue for me and for my children, for my grandchildren, is a very, very serious, real problem. And I agree that it's something that has to do with the fact that we need a younger activism and younger leadership that should lead these conversations. I want to first of all congratulate you as Americans and congratulate all of us really as global citizens for avoiding 4 more years of Trump. And Biden has won the presidency, and if all goes well, you know, we really have avoided these disastrous 4 more years. Yet one of Biden's most prominent debate lines was that he promised not to ban fracking. That was something that he was very insistent on, and it was a competition of who wants to not ban fracking more. And this is just one example that really, for me, is very alarming. That you know, the next U.S. president, after very, very difficult 4 years, what will be the best strategy for climate action or policy change under a Biden presidency?
Well, I'm actually doing a study right now that environmental groups and labor groups in Pennsylvania have commissioned me to do. So I'm right in the middle of the discussion on fracking. And I'd like to give you some results. But before I do, I want to declare an interest here. My daughter, as you all know, but everyone knows, is a member Banding Together, a very active member. And so I have a very high regard for this organization that I have for many years. So let me just tell you a little bit about the fracking situation in Pennsylvania. It's true that from 2008 on, you have this rapid development of fracking, which is underground channeling and extraction of natural gas that was supposed to be a big economic boom in Pennsylvania. And that's why even Biden and Kamala Harris both said, absolutely not, we're not going to ban fracking. Well, okay. Now, there are about 20,000 people that are employed in Pennsylvania in the fracking, and that's in a labor force of 6 million. Now, if we talk about something like a Green New Deal program to transition Pennsylvania to a zero emissions economy in 30 years, over the course of 30 years, which according to my own estimates would be about, require about 2.5% of their state economy per year invested in clean energy, energy efficiency, and the just transition for the workers who are going to lose their jobs. Okay, so that's going to generate about 170,000 jobs per year in Pennsylvania. At the same time, the fracking jobs, as we wind down the 20,000 people who are employed in fracking over the next 20 to 30 years, and even if we take account of the people who are going to voluntarily retire when they reach age 65, we're looking at about 1,000 jobs a year. So we have 170,000 jobs being generated through a clean economy, whereas we lose about 1,000 per year by winding down fracking. So this notion that Pennsylvania, which was set up as the case during the presidential campaign, was set up as the case in which the environmental extremists want to take away employment opportunities, it's absolutely false in Pennsylvania. It is a major opportunity to generate more jobs in Pennsylvania by transitioning to a clean economy. Now, it is true that in Pennsylvania, as every place else, the people in fracking and fossil fuels more generally will lose their jobs over time because we're shutting down the industry. We have to, as Noam said, to save the planet. So what do you do about it? Well, it's actually very easy. This is what we call a just transition. And the concept was first developed by the great labor leader, Tony Mazzocchi, in an earlier phase talking about transition out of nuclear energy and also out of coal. So basically, we have to give a very generous level of support to all the workers, their families, and their community. And since we're talking about 1,000 people a year, this is a trivial problem in Pennsylvania and is equally trivial as long as you make the commitment in other areas as well. In addition to the giving support in terms of finding new jobs, retraining, giving wage level support so that people's wages don't go down, guaranteeing pensions, all of those things. Then you also have to think about reinvesting in the same communities by cleaning up the coal mines, by cleaning up the fracking operations, environmental cleanup, and then repurpose land for other investments, including clean energy. It's very straightforward, and it's actually not very expensive. A study I just also put out for the U.S. as a whole, I estimated the cost of this kind of just transition as about $2 billion a year for the next 30 years in the U.S. That's less than 1/100th of 1% U.S. GDP. That's what we're talking about in order to treat people decently who will transition out.
Still, I completely support.
Add a comment that you might obviously asking yourself the question, why didn't the Democratic Party inform people in Pennsylvania that of these facts, that you can have a better life, more jobs, save the planet? They never said that. They just said, no, we have to have fracking. Why? Are they trying to lose the state, destroy the economy? No, they don't care about the people of Pennsylvania. What they care about is about the fossil fuel companies and Wall Street. That's the Democratic Party. They're not a party concerned with the population. They're concerned with the donor class. That's the Clintonite party. So if Pennsylvania goes down the tube, it's pretty much the same in Israel. If Israel goes underwater, the Mediterranean boils, we have to have the people with money. We have to satisfy them. Fossil fuel companies aren't going to fund our campaign unless we shine their shoes. And if Pennsylvania is destroyed, that's not our problem. The Democratic Party is split between Republicans. We can start, I'm sorry, but we just have to not consider them a political party at this point. Won't lot to say about that. Maybe it can change, but at the moment they're off the spectrum. 70% of them think the election was stolen and are ready to be mobilized to struggle against it and to support the authentic president. For maybe he'll be in Mar-a-Lago in Florida. But the Democratic Party is split. The management of the party, Democratic National Committee, DNC, they are Clintonite. They're not, as Clinton once described himself, he said, I'm a moderate Republican. That's correct. They're what used to be called moderate Republicans. They're oriented towards Wall Street, towards the donors, towards the wealthy elites. Their political campaign, if you look at it, disregarded working people, disregarded the poor. They poured huge amounts of money into trying to influence people in the affluent suburbs. See if we can get some of these Republicans to vote for us. That's basically what the campaign was. People in Pennsylvania, people in South, Hispanic workers, Mexican workers in South Texas, for the first time in a century, voted Republican because they thought they were going to lose their jobs in the oil industry. Nobody from the Democratic Party went down to organize and instruct and educate and say, look, you're not going to lose your job, you're going to get better jobs. What Bob just said, Nobody from the Democratic Party said. They're concerned with the major donor class. Now, fortunately, there is a political base, mostly young people, who are pressing very hard to change all of this. That's happening in many parts of the world. Not so much in Israel, I'm sorry to say, but in many parts of the world it is happening, and I think that's the hope of the future. We sometimes see this dramatically. So, as I'm sure you know, in every January, the people who call themselves the masters of the universe gather in a fancy ski resort in Switzerland, Davos, and they talk about how wonderful they are, have a marvelous time, and so on. But the Davos meeting last January opened with something that's recorded that you really ought to. It's classic. You ought to show it. They had two keynote speeches at the beginning to open the meetings. One, of course, was the chief master of the universe, Donald Trump, who gave a praise rant about how magnificent he was, and so on and so forth. The people in the audience were cringing in embarrassment. But when he was finished, they gave him a royal welcome clap because he got one sentence right. He said, "I'm going to work for you." So they're willing to tolerate the rest of the antics. That was the first speaker. Second speaker was a 17-year-old girl, Greta Thunberg, got up and gave a quiet, factual, accurate description of what's happening in the world, and ended up saying quietly, "You've betrayed us." She got a kind of polite claps and then pat on the head and said, "Go back to school, we'll take care of it." That's the world. She was symbolic of the way to save the world. And that's what we're seeing. Climate strikes for young people. Those who pressed the Biden campaign to include at least something about climate change. Not terrible, not enough. Those are young people. The United States Sunrise Movement. And that's the hope for survival for your children and grandchildren. Young people to press those who have betrayed them.
That's true. Yeah, Sunrise Movement is doing a great job in the U.S. I hope they'll be able to expand even further. And you talked about really organizing as one of the ways, one of the mechanisms, really. But could you maybe talk about what is the Green New Deal? We're here to talk really about it. Just maybe we can expand a little bit more on it. What does it mean? And what are some of the mechanisms that we could use to attain it?
Well, I'll talk a bit about it. My understanding of the Green New Deal, there's various definitions, and as you said, the term's been around actually a long time. It was actually originated by Thomas Friedman, the New York Times columnist, a long time ago. My understanding of the Green New Deal and the thing that Noam and I work out in the book, it's basically a way to get to the zero emissions economy. Global economy within the time frame set out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the UN agency which has monitored this issue more than any others. And we've got to get to, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, we have to get to net zero emissions by 2050. And so that's 29 years from now. We have to roughly cut emissions by 50% by 2030. That's 9 years from now. And as we've pointed out, as Noam has pointed out elsewhere, the IPCC's own estimates are maybe on the conservative end as to what's needed to get on a climate stabilization path. But let's say that's the one that we're going to aim for. So the point is to get there. And the point is to get there in a way that also is expanding opportunities, such as I just described in Pennsylvania, because it's the only way we're going to move forward. We have to do it in a way that expands job opportunities, expands income opportunities, enables communities to thrive, reduces poverty. And all of those things are actually easily attainable within the framework of the Green New Deal, as I understand it. Why? Well, because building a clean energy economy entails building, and it's investments. Investments mean jobs. So as I was describing in Pennsylvania, you can generalize it. Investing in renewable energy, solar, wind, investing in raising energy efficiency will create millions of jobs in the United States, hundreds of millions of jobs throughout the world. So that's the first step. And of course, then we contract the fossil fuel economy down to zero over the next 20 or so years. And then we have to also establish these just transition measures for the people that will be hurt through the contraction of the fossil fuel industry. There's not that many of them, but they are there, and we have to treat them well. That was the principle set out by Tony Mazzocchi long ago, and that is the simple principle that adheres now. So those are the main features of the Green New Deal. It's that simple. The other big feature, the other big source of emissions is deforestation and the spread of industrial agriculture that relies heavily on nitrogen fertilizer, which also generates emissions. So we have to move away from industrial agriculture towards organic agriculture. We have to stop deforestation and invest in reforestation and get energy emissions down to zero. And then through reforestation, you absorb the existing CO2 in the atmosphere so you can get to absolute zero emissions or negative emissions, possibly. That's the Green New Deal. It's a program to stabilize the climate and to advance job opportunities and greater equality. And those are the core principles.
Noam, do you want to add something?
Couldn't hear.
Would you like to add something?
The thing I'd like to add is somebody has to bring that message to the general population. They have to understand it. And it's not going to come from the Democratic Party leadership or the equivalents in Israel. It's not going to come from the major media. It's got to come from people like you. It's your task to save the human species from suicide. As simple as that. It's very striking to see the way it works in the liberal press in the United States. So take in the last presidential debate, at the very end of the debate, Joe Biden said, we have to move to save the world from destruction. Actually, those weren't his words. His words were, we have to move to net zero emissions, to transition to end fossil fuels. Everyone gasped. How could he make this terrible mistake? Gaffe, it was called. It's destroyed his campaign. We have to back away from it. How can we dare to try to save the world from destruction? That's the liberal press. And in fact, when you look at it's very interesting to look at the coverage of the election. As I mentioned, one of the striking results was what happened in South Texas along the border. Mexican-American community voted Democratic for a century, literally, switched. Part of the explanations were given by liberal commentators. It's Biden's gaffe. Biden made this terrible mistake, and that lost South Texas for us. In other words, it's wrong to say, let's try to save the world from destruction. That's a terrible mistake. This is the liberal commentators, okay? That's what we're dealing with. No, none of them said, let's go down to South Texas, organize people, work with them, get them to understand that they can have a much better life without destroying the economy. Actually, in some places, people did it, not the Democratic Party, local organizers. So where I live in Arizona, big Mexican-American community, there were Latino organizers coming from the community who've worked hard for years, in fact, and have organized the community on this and other issues. They voted against Trump, okay? That happened if you look at the places where the Democrats won by a sliver, it's places like Maricopa County in Arizona, big county where there was Latino organizing. Philadelphia, where there was activist Black organizing. Atlanta, Georgia, same thing. Nevada, same thing. That's what barely handed the election to the Democrats, not the Democratic National Committee. As I said, they were busy pouring huge amounts of money into trying to convince a couple of affluent suburban women that they should shift from Republican to Democrat. That's what we're facing. And you have your own analog of it. Those are the tasks that young people have to face. It'd be nice if the older generation weren't betraying them, but they are and continue to.
We wholeheartedly agree, and this is why, as a movement, we dedicate ourselves to organizing and to building power. And as a political movement, we find ourselves every time we write a flyer trying to level between being pragmatic and being very idealistic and aspiring for a better future. You mentioned that to battle climate change in the time that we have left, we can't wait to first replace capitalism, and we need to work within it. Noam does mention hope that this project can be a stepping stone to a more dramatic system change. Yet at the same time, your plan does pose significant changes to the current form of austerity neoliberal capitalism. You talk about government direct investment, you talk about labor unions, you talk about democratic ownership structures. How do you, in your program, level those two sides of the coin, and what do you say to those that are asking for a revolution? I'd like to direct it to both of you.
For those who are what?
Asking for a revolution.
Revolution. Grow up. A revolution if a revolution takes place, I don't mean a revolution towards a fascist state, but a progressive revolution. There's a prerequisite. The prerequisite is that the overwhelming majority of the population has been trying to achieve reforms and comes to the realization that the institutions that exist are so resistant to changes that will improve our lives and prospects. They're so resistant that we have to dismantle them. Are we there? No, we're there. So let's grow up, face the world that exists. There are, in fact, ways to begin to move towards a social revolution which would overturn repressive institutions. One way is to push reforms to their limit, to see how far they can go, get people to understand there are barriers you have to overcome. The other way is simply to build alternative institutions within the present society. It has to be on a small scale, of course, but it can be done. The labor movement, in fact, United Steelworkers, major union, is beginning to work with a major worker-owned, worker-managed industrial conglomerate in Spain, Mondragon. It's been around for 60 years, very successful. They're trying to work with it to see if elements of that can be duplicated in the United States. And it's beginning to happen. In the old deindustrialized areas. There's the beginning of development of worker-owned enterprises, and not trying to carry out to overthrow capitalism, but to work within the system so that they can build and expand both independent worker-owned enterprises and spread the consciousness that this can be done, leading to others to join with them. Those are all things that can be done. But to say, let's have a revolution, that's like saying, let's ask the sun to stop shining. You can't have a revolution that way. You have to prepare, set the groundwork for it. That's a lot of hard work.
So I would just add a little bit. First of all, you know, when we say we want a revolution, we have to be a little more specific as to what that entails. If we want to say that a revolution entails public ownership as opposed to capitalism having private ownership of major assets, it's already the case that we have a revolution, therefore, in the energy. 90% of all fossil fuel assets are publicly owned already. So simply saying public ownership as a form of socialism is anyway a solution to climate change has already been nullified by the fact that we already have public ownership of most energy assets in the world. Secondly, I'll just also add one of the really critical opportunities that is happening if we really think about shutting down the global fossil fuel industry and supplanting it with clean energy, solar power, wind power, investing in high efficiency, is that it does open up massive amounts of space for alternative ownership forms. And that also, as Noam was talking about with Mondragon, that also is happening within the interstices of capitalism right now. I mean, it's mainly happening so far in Western Europe, where you have small-scale public co-ops owning wind farms, solar farms, but elsewhere as well. I was just reading some work on actually rural areas in Alaska, where the best way to set up an energy system is small-scale renewable energy as opposed to shipping in fossil fuel energy by plane. So they actually have rural co-ops sprouting in rural areas in Alaska. In the Great Plains states in the United States, the Dakotas, almost totally unnoticed, private farmers, small-scale farmers, are using their own land to put up turbines, wind turbines, and they're making more money off of their wind turbines than they are from their agricultural products. So that's small-scale enterprises. Some of them are private, some of them are cooperative. But imagine supplanting the entire global energy sector, which we have to do over the next 20, 30 years, and creating these huge opportunities, including, you know, big opportunities for cooperative enterprise. Sub-Saharan Africa, India, 40–50% of the population has no access to electricity. Building gigantic fossil fuel-based utilities hasn't happened, and it's not going to happen. The capitalists haven't figured out a way to make it affordable. But putting up small-scale things like they're doing in Alaska right now is affordable. It can be done. So it's an opportunity to, as Noam said, build new institutional forms within the framework of our existing capitalist global economy.
Yeah, in fact, we have such an example here in the unrecognized villages, Bedouin villages in the Naqab, in the Negev, in the south, where many of the villages don't have access to water or electricity, and they actually have smaller, you know, local initiatives and enterprises of solar system. They sure have a lot of sun there. So we have a lot of this, and I think we need to have more of it.
And so just on the, so the solar, people have to remember the costs of solar have come down dramatically. So to do that in the Negev even 10 years ago would have been twice as expensive as it is now, and it's coming down even further. And I would just add, the main reason why the solar costs are coming down are due to China. China is the one that are building more efficient solar panels. We in the United States are way, way far behind. But in any case, that's why it is now something that, you know, is a realistic possibility to build low-cost, small-scale enterprises in Alaska, even where there's hardly any sun. But if you combine it with a wind turbine and you put up solar panels, it's actually working.
Add to this that another task for young people moving to a different plane is to try to put an end to the policies led by the United States, to some extent followed by Europe, to try to prevent China from developing. This is insane. One of the major projects of US policy, and unfortunately Biden has joined in this, is to try to prevent China's development. We should be listening to your slogan up there, Omdim B'Yachad, working with China to gain from what they're achieving and to contribute to it. This is not only happening in energy, but take a look at what's happening with the pandemic. China apparently is in the lead in developing a vaccine. In Brazil, they have just canceled testing, fortunately only temporarily. The reasons that were presented were fraudulent. The main reasons is to try to keep the world from benefiting from a Chinese vaccine. Let's make sure that we can kill lots of people so it doesn't come from China, orders from Washington. Let's see if we can make sure that Pfizer, a Western multinational, can make profits from a vaccine which is called the Pfizer vaccine. It was in fact invented by a couple of young scientists in Germany who gave it to Pfizer to market and propagandize for. So we have to make sure we use the Pfizer vaccine, not the more advanced Chinese one. Things like this are happening on every front, and it is insane. These are international issues. We have to work on them together. That's pandemic, global warming, the nuclear war. These are not things that are bounded anywhere. There has to be international cooperation on them. And again, the leadership is going to have to be taken on these issues by young people. The older generation has on all these issues betrayed everyone. The China issue as well. Not that China's a nice place. A lot of horrible things going on there. We should be trying to support those who are opposing them, but not prevent the country from developing solar panels or vaccines.
Yeah. Oh, you have to go for it.
We see that you've mentioned the COVID crisis and the pandemic, and we do see that while this is a very severe health crisis, this is also a social crisis and an economic crisis and educational crisis. And we see that the government's ability to act decisively in the common interest is key. Where this is not the case, the measures taken were very bad. In Israel, I think one of the lowest stimulus packages in the world, and we can really see it with business closing every day and really a significant economical crisis. Climate change will also cause areas of the economy to shut down. Whole regions will be shut down, especially in our area. And I wanted to ask, how do you see the relation between response measures to the COVID crisis and also to climate change, and how do you think these are related?
I think what, as Noam said, we have these dramatically different experiences. Vietnam, a country of 95 million people, per capita income is 3% of U.S. and they basically have no deaths. Or at this point, the last time I checked, maybe 25 total in a country, 1/3 of the population of the United States, where we've had over 240,000. So yes, it's certainly controllable. It is a social phenomenon. It's not simply a matter of medical failure and a pandemic. It's how you deal with it. So of course, the same thing could be said about the climate crisis. And there are countries that have done better. One example is Sweden, where you have seen the economy growing and emissions declining. So that's called absolute decoupling. That's what every country needs to do, which is continue growing in a good way, egalitarian way, but get off of fossil fuels and get off of industrial agriculture. It's analytically, it's actually very straightforward. Solving it politically is an entirely different matter. And as we were talking about with the Biden campaign, if you looked at the initial program of the Democratic Party coming out of the convention and coming out of these joint committees with the Sanders and Biden teams together, there was a reasonably good program on paper. They literally took that program off the internet. I don't know exactly which day, but when Noam and we were communicating, I think we were the ones who may have discovered this. They literally took it down and replaced it with the Biden program. So when Biden was in the debate saying, it's the Biden program, don't read any of the other stuff. Well, the Biden program has, some nice rhetoric, but obviously it is not committed to ending fracking whatsoever. And it is not committed to solar. It is not committed to renewable energy, surprisingly. The main focus is on so-called carbon capture technology, meaning you still can, burn natural gas, you still burn coal, but then you have these technologies that literally capture the carbon and store it underground for thousands of years. So that, the problem is, as Noam says, it's political. I myself have been involved with a lot of labor groups that I'm very happy to see that the labor groups have gotten engaged around this issue in the United States and in Europe, and slightly I've been in Africa as well. So there is stirring, I would say. There is some hope there. And they're not all young people. So it's great that the young people are taking the lead and they're getting a message through to people, working people, and not just environmentalists, but people in the labor movement.
Thank you. Well, we do have 13 minutes left, and we do want to talk about the Green New Deal in Israel. However, it is important for me personally to ask a question. I would like if you could answer it very briefly, if you could. The issues of race and the national question are very central to the political discourse here in Israel and similarly in the U.S. And it's really far outranks the environmental issues. Here, in Standing Together, our work really stems from a holistic worldview that identifies the interrelation between the ongoing occupation of Palestinian territories, the growing systematic discrimination and inequality within Israeli society, as well as attacks by the government on democratic freedoms of the Palestinian citizens of Israel. We really see this interrelation, and that also, of course, extends to the struggle of environmental justice and of the climate crisis. We think that avoiding these issues would really diminish the chances of a hegemonic struggle against climate change or any major struggle, really, our society faces locally, regionally, or globally. Maybe you could say just a couple of words about that. I would really love to know how does maybe the GND accounts for this struggle and the interrelation between race and climate change.
How the situation, the political situation within the former Palestine, Israel, and the occupied territories, how that relates to these issues. Well, as long as there's the population in Cisjordan, Jordan to the sea, as long as there's the split between the populations, with one of them dominating the other, as long as that's not overcome, it's going to be extremely hard to deal with the climate crisis or any other social problem. Not time enough to go through the whole history, but it's important to bear in mind that at least two things. One thing is that the discussion of these issues is seriously mistaken. The discussion within Israel, in international debate and so on, poses two alternatives and asks which one we should have. One alternative is the international consensus on two states. The other is one state, and for the Palestinians, let's have an anti-apartheid struggle. Those are not the two alternatives. As long as that framework is established, discussion is pointless. There is no one state alternative. Israel will never agree to become a Palestinian state with a Jewish minority. Fixed. It's like calling for a revolution. It's not going to happen. The alternative, and there's no support for it internationally, none. So talking about that is meaningless. There are two alternatives. One of them is the international consensus. The other is the Greater Israel Project, what actually exists, what you can see if you travel on the fancy highways in the West Bank. That's what exists. Israel, since for 50 years, has been slowly, steadily, step by step, both political groupings moving towards developing a system in the West Bank in which Israel takes over whatever it wants, whatever's of value, but leaves out the population, the Palestinian population centers. So Israel doesn't want Nablus, it doesn't want Tulkar. It wants to deal with the so-called demographic problem. Not too many Arabs in a Jewish state. When you look at the development projects, that's the way it's been going. Ma'ale Adumim, Ariel, Adumim, highways, massive highways leading to them. You can live in your subsidized villa in Ma'ale Adumim and go to work in Tel Aviv on a fancy highway and not know there's any Palestinians. Take the Jordan Valley, we'll take that, kick the Palestinians out. The Palestinians who are left are separated into, by now, almost 200 enclaves where they're surrounded by checkpoints so they can't get to their olive groves or fields unless the soldiers decide to let them through. That's the alternative that is taking place before our eyes. That's the alternative to two states. That goes on, you're not going to be able to deal with the other problems. And that has to be overcome. But at first, we have to recognize it. The second thing to recognize is that since the 1970s, by the 1970s, the Israeli leadership, it was then Labor, made a fateful decision. They had a choice between security and expansion. There were possibilities in the mid-70s. They've continued to reach something. Well, I'll quote the words. In 1976, it actually came to a head with a Security Council resolution calling for two states to be established on the Green Line, internationally recognized border, with the right of each state to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized borders. It was supported by Egypt, by Syria, by Jordan, by almost the entire world. Israel was furious. Yitzhak Rabin was then prime minister, denounced it and said, we'll never have any discussion with Palestinians, no states, no nothing. Herzog was then ambassador to the UN. I said it was written by the PLO in order to destroy Israel, which is, of course, nonsense. And the United States vetoed the resolution. Okay, now that's what's been happening ever since. And as long as that continues, these issues of working together to solve major problems are not going to be possible. Now, again, there are alternatives, but we have to be realistic about it. We have to face what's happening. Now, actually, here is a serious problem. A lot depends on what happens in the United States. The U.S. has overwhelming power. When the U.S. lays down the law, Israel follows it, even if it doesn't like it. Every U.S. president prior to Obama had imposed sharp constraints on Israel, compelled it to do things it didn't want to do. Obama was the first not to do that. Trump, of course, is off in some other dimension. But in the United States, there's a split developing in the population, which sooner or later will affect policy. Israel used to be the darling of the liberal community, not only in the United States, but around the world. It was this wonderful social democracy. Young people go and live in a kibbutz for a couple of months. Marvelous. That was then. It's not now. By now, Israel's become a kind of pariah state. Among liberal Americans, there's actually more support for Palestinian rights than for Israel, especially true among young people, even including young Jews. Support for Israel has shifted in the United States from the liberal community to the most reactionary parts of the country. Evangelical Christians, ultranationalists, the extreme right, that's support for Israel. Sooner or later, this may affect policy. Now, there are lots of things that could be done if there were, in the United States, a genuine Palestinian solidarity organization, and there isn't. The space for it has been taken by the BDS movement, which is suicidal. They're following policies which cannot succeed, clear why they cannot succeed, and they're rigidly following them. Okay? That can change, and it should, again, going back to your slogan, be working jointly with people like you. There should be an Israeli-American peace movement that is working to overcome the social, economic, political crises which have been imposed and which are avoidable. Can be done. And that's, I think, critical for solving this problem. US policy shifts, everything will change in the Middle East.
We'd like to thank you very much for your time and this interview. This truly was a pleasure and very enlightening. And we'll be happy to take you on your invite.
I was about to say.
The Professor Chomsky has to come back too.
Yeah. And thank you for your time. Goodbye.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay.